It is a truism that foreign policy does not decide elections. It is true that the UK voters who decided at this week's general election to give some other mob a go at running the place had plenty of domestic reasons for doing so. But a new government will mean a new foreign policy. The as-yet unanswered question is what kind. The UK's new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has campaigned extremely carefully, understanding from a long way out that his role was keeping his own Labour Party together while the incumbent Conservatives self-destructed. It was significant, however, that one of his few missteps as he sauntered to 10 Downing Street was related to foreign policy. Many people who might have been presumed natural Labour voters deserted over his hesitant, confused response to Israel's war in Gaza. 5 seats which Labour might have expected or hoped to win were taken by pro-Palestine independents. A few more were near-run things. This coming week, the UK's new PM will make his bow on the global stage, attending the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., which will remind him, like he needs it, that foreign policy matters. The West is, at barely one remove, at war with Russia. The transatlantic special relationship, bedrock of British foreign policy thinking for decades, is threatened by the prospect of a Trump restoration. What can the world expect of Sir Keir Starmer? What, if any, impact does he aspire to make on it? And where does he even start? This is the Foreign Desk.
Starmer's approach would be, and his administration's approach would be, to say, as the US and UK, we have a lot more common ground. So we're going to have to be thinking a lot more laterally about what this relationship means. The ties are much deeper than any one president.
I think the tone will change dramatically and almost immediately. Even in the Labour manifesto, the language is quite striking. The UK, again, is going to be a leader in Europe. I mean, that's language we haven't heard since Tony Blair, really. So I think in stylistic terms, we will see a very, very big shift, and I think that will be mirrored on both sides of the channel.
But there is an idea that the UK needs to come back to the world stage. It's been absent from Brexit. And now that President Emmanuel Macron has his own domestic woes, that's another opportunity actually for the UK to then have greater influence and again to play a more traditional role that it's had, to try to mediate, to try to come up with solutions.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller. I'm joined first of all by Claire Ainsley, Director of the Project on Centre-Left Renewal at the Progressive Policy Institute and previously the Executive Director of Policy for Sir Keir Starmer. Claire, what did you learn from that about what Sir Keir Starmer's view of the transatlantic relationship in particular is? Does it differ in any way from that of previous UK Prime Ministers?
So I worked with Keir Starmer pretty closely for about 2.5 years as his Director of Policy. And it's fair to say that a lot of our focus, of course, was the pandemic at that time. So there wasn't a huge amount of attention on foreign policy. And of course, Labour were really far behind in the polls for quite a long period. It's only been more latterly that people have paid attention to what Starmer's worldview is, if you like, and to the efforts that his shadow foreign team have been putting in to resetting the UK's relationship in the world. And I think it will differ in some quite important ways. It's been presented to many audiences as being essentially continuity, because Starmer's been very clear that he wanted to position the Labour Party, were they to come into power, as backing Zelensky's fight in Ukraine against the illegal invasion. Starmer personally has made several visits to Ukraine. His Shadow Defence Secretary, John Healey, has been very clear about Labour's support for NATO. All of that is really important, but it's perhaps given an impression that it's continuity in terms of foreign policy. And I think that perhaps overlooks some of the important differences there might be with the current Conservative government. So in particular, David Lammy has put forward a case for what he's called progressive realism. So we do want to advance progressive values, but be realistic about the world as we find it. And the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has set out a new economic doctrine, which she's called Securonomics. But whatever you think about the phraseology, she made quite an important speech last year from Washington, D.C., about globalization essentially, and saying, look, the world has changed. We need to shore up our supply chains in a very different way. So I think there are some quite important differences which will mean that foreign policy will evolve, even if it's not an abrupt shift.
Do you think it's fair to say, though, that he does still fundamentally regard the transatlantic relationship, the special relationship, as UK prime ministers call it rather more often than US presidents do, as nevertheless crucial?
He would view the transatlantic relationship as absolutely crucial, and that will be the case whoever is in the White House. And obviously the US have their own important elections taking place later this year. But also, if we do see a change in the White House and we don't know what's going to happen, it is probably even more important that we have a UK which is seeing itself as more of a partner around the table, in a way that the Conservatives have perhaps been a bit more inward looking because we've been dealing with the aftermath of that referendum in 2016.
Looking specifically at the transatlantic relationship, though, in the near term, he has what would seem to be, for a Labour leader, an advantage in that there is a Democratic administration in the White House. Do you think that might interest the United States again a bit more in the relationship? Biden's attitude to the transatlantic relationship has seemed somewhat diffident compared to a few of his predecessors.
Well, I think having a change at number 10 Downing Street will be, in the round, pretty helpful for the UK overall, because I think the US have been one of those nations which have experienced, as I say, this somewhat inward-looking government. And it's not the Conservatives don't value the transatlantic relationship. They absolutely do, as does the Labour Party. But they've been so embroiled in this kind of internal chaos, which is, we could do a whole separate programme on that, that it's meant that there has not been the investment and the forward-looking relationships built that there might have been. So setting aside the difference in parties for one moment, I don't think we should assume that just because there's Democrats in the White House and there's Conservatives being in the government in the UK, that you can't have a shared set of interests. Like, clearly on the Israel-Gaza conflict, there are deep and important relationships that stand there, and the UK's been pretty steadfast in its backing, certainly initially after the 7th of October attacks, and that has changed somewhat of late. But you will also see, I think, there being much more of a focus on that relationship, and there should be no assumption that there would be a drift in the UK towards a kind of more protectionist economics that has caused real waves really across on this side of the Atlantic from some of the moves that Trump initially made in terms of tariffs and so on and so forth, and then more of the investment obviously that Biden administration have put into their infrastructure. That has had, in terms of foreign affairs, that has had a big impact on the US's place and conversations and standing with its previous allies, who of course feel somewhat on the back foot because the economic policy essentially from the US has changed, and obviously we'll want to see a UK which is really engaging with the US to make sure that we have continuing free trade that is advantaging all of our nations, but also that doesn't sort of shut down future markets in a way that would be advantageous for our exporters.
On the subject of Trump, though, there is a definite non-zero possibility that trying to manage a relationship with a returned President Trump will be something Starmer has to do. Donald Trump, one of the things we do know about him is that he is someone who takes absolutely everything personally. It doesn't strike me, at least, that the two men are naturally similar characters. How do you think Starmer, knowing him as you do, would manage a relationship with someone like President Trump?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to say that not only their parties different, but their approach to politics and international diplomacy is somewhat different. You would never see Keir Starmer tweet out his, you can't say tweet now, X out now, his overtures to a president or even a foe. So they have really different styles. But I would say, honestly, I think the UK overall struggled really to deal with Trump presidency the first time around. You might remember that our Prime Minister at the time was Theresa May, a Conservative, and I think that she was acting in the best national interest in doing this, tried to establish a relationship with Trump and the administration which was functional, was as warm as it could be. But I don't think she was particularly rewarded for that. I think there was that kind of renowned White House visit that gained a lot of publicity in the UK, where Trump sort of made this sort of awkward gesture towards her hand. And I think for Theresa May, who was a very senior, respected politician, it didn't go down well. So I don't think it's just that Labour would struggle to deal with Trump. I think it is that the UK have struggled to deal with Trump the first time round. This time around, David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, has made a lot of effort to start to build relationships with the potential incoming Trump administration as well as the Biden administration.
David Lammy, the new Foreign Secretary, has also made quite a lot of remarks about Donald Trump that maybe quite a lot of British people would be broadly sympathetic with, but you don't need to be too imaginative to picture the Trump administration and or its media cheerleaders rather picking up on these. How would Starmer handle something like that? Would he stand by his Foreign Secretary?
Well, you can see already that David Lammy has somewhat moved away from some of those personal remarks about Donald Trump. He's, I think, trying to establish, like, where's the common ground here? I think that's what Starmer's approach would be and his administration's approach would be to say, look, as the US and UK, we have a lot more in common. We have a lot more common ground. Where are going to be our common challenges? And top of that list is going to be Ukraine, I'm sure, and that will be the number one concern, and I'm sure it will be the number one concern of many of our allies in NATO too. We do not want to see Ukraine lose territory and lose that war to Russia, and therefore that would be the number one concern. So I think, in a sense, we're going to have to be thinking a lot more laterally about what this relationship means. The ties are much deeper than any one president. The relationships are forming. I think we have to recognise that this isn't a natural partnership that you might imagine. This is not a Blair and Clinton style, at Camp David or at Chequers that you can imagine. And I don't think we should be expecting that kind of repeat. But we know that Trump has an affection and admiration for the UK. We have certainly a huge amount invested in that transatlantic relationship. So I think the broad, deep politics of it are as they were. I think the difficulty is our different approaches and how we deal with these dictators and authoritarian regimes, which we would have a fundamentally different view. But so would the Conservatives, to be quite truthful.
Claire, thank you for joining us. That was Claire Ainsley, former Executive Director of Policy to Sir Keir Starmer. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I'm joined now by Anand Menon, Director of UK in a Changing Europe and Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London. Anand, let's start with the B word. It's something that Starmer has been at pains not to mention during this campaign. He doesn't want to talk about Brexit. He doesn't want to reopen that issue, which is probably understandable enough right now. But do we know what he actually thinks about it?
Well, we know, I think, that he thinks leaving was a mistake because he campaigned for Remain. But equally, I think we're pretty certain that he thinks that Brexit isn't a priority of his now, and that negotiating some far-reaching changes to the existing trade agreement isn't on his to-do list.
Because just this week, in one of his last press conferences as leader of the opposition, he took quite a hard line on this when asked about it. He said not only did he not envisage the UK rejoining the EU in his lifetime, he also said the same about the single market and the customs union. Again, is that him just trying to keep his electoral coalition together, or do we think maybe something about the wonders of Brexit since 2016 has actually changed his mind?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? If you pass the statement, then one hopes for his sake he's not in office throughout the period he had in mind, i.e. till he dies. I mean, a lot of that is going to be outside his purview because one assumes he'll have left office. I think he's doing several things. I think on the one hand, I have a certain sympathy with what he said because I think rejoining the single market or the customs union, or indeed rejoining the European Union, is going to be very, very hard for us to do. It's going to be hard for it to get on the political agenda with sustained support. It's going to be hard to negotiate. It's going to be hard to carry off. So you can see why he's saying that. But more immediately, politically, he wants to shut the debate down. He doesn't want to open the way, and it's probably muscle memory by now. He's so used to trying to shut this down, I think for fear of being, Starmer the Remainer and being attacked by the Conservatives, that he just doesn't want to have that conversation. Whether or not he's forced into having that conversation, even against his will, once he comes into office, is another interesting question.
All that notwithstanding, can we at least hope that the relationship between the EU and the UK will defrost a little from the EU side? They won't blame Starmer for Brexit, obviously, because, as you point out, he campaigned against it. Might it be, I guess, a dynamic similar to what we saw when the Law and Justice Party were recently tipped out in Poland? Donald Tusk led a more EU-friendly Liberal coalition to power, and, the sighs of relief from the EU were all but audible.
Oh, absolutely. I think the tone will change dramatically and almost immediately. I think we'll see it at the NATO summit. I think we'll see it even more at the European Political Community meeting on the 18th of July here in Oxfordshire. I think Keir Starmer, even in the Labour manifesto, the language is quite striking. Labour is going to repair relationships with European states, repair relationships with the EU. The UK, again, is going to be a leader in Europe. I mean, that's language we haven't heard since Tony Blair, really. So I think in stylistic terms, we will see a very, very big shift, and I think that will be mirrored on both sides of the channel.
How do you think he faces the challenge, though, of certainly the UK's closest geographic continental neighbour, i.e. France, disappearing down the far-right populist wormhole? It is not impossible that he might find himself very shortly dealing with a France whose government is dominated by the National Rally, and not at all impossible that he finds himself a few years from now trying to make conversation with President Marine Le Pen.
I think he'll do business with them. He's made that perfectly clear. I'm not sure he will do what Rishi Sunak has done with Giorgia Meloni and become best mates with them necessarily, but I think he's willing to do business with them. And of course, if you look at it the other way around, right-wing populists in Europe are very, very keen on the UK. They're very, very keen on us because we took on the European Union as they see it. They're keen to do this. I mean, one of the paradoxes of that situation, should it arise, is I think right-wing populist governments in Europe will be far keener to do bilateral deals with the UK than centrist governments, partly because for those right-wing populists, cocking a snoop at Brussels is a positively good thing to do.
But is Starmer the kind of politician who would be, I guess, amenable or even adaptable to becoming some kind of defender of the liberal order, especially if the UK finds itself, and again, not impossible, marooned between a populist authoritarian United States and a populist authoritarian France?
I mean, it's very hard to say. He's got no professional experience of foreign affairs. We know what the manifesto says, and on the big foreign policy issues, there is no difference between what Labour are saying and what the Conservatives are saying on Gaza and on Ukraine. I think Starmer will be a pragmatist. I mean, that's what his domestic record indicates, that he will work on the basis of what he sees as in his and the country's short-term interests. And given that, he will, even if there's a Trump in the White House, continue to work quite closely with the United States as well. Whether he becomes some crusading figure, I find quite unlikely, given that he's been unable to do that in terms of domestic politics throughout this election campaign. I
mean, it's obviously more difficult for the UK as long as it remains, ironically, outside the European Union. But is any Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer in particular, still able to lead or drive events in Europe? Might he want to take the same kind of leading position on Ukraine, for example, as Boris Johnson, to his credit? To his credit, absolutely. Yeah, genuinely did.
We absolutely did. I think the style will be very different. I think the other thing that will change, I mean, two things will change that will be quite interesting in terms of tone. Firstly, the slightly hectoring tone of previous Conservative governments towards the European Union, very quick to criticise them for not doing enough, making everything competitive. That will go. And secondly, we will, I think, have a government that is publicly invested in the success of European integration. And that too will mark a change, because under the Conservative government since 2019, there's been that slight element of, if the European Union were doing badly, that's good because we're doing relatively well. I think it'll be more positive sum under Starmer. We can play a leading role in defence. We're still there in NATO. The Labour Party have made it clear they want to sign a security deal with the Germans within the next 6 months, and I think they will do this. So I think simply by being stable, by being relatively unchallenged at home, as it looks like he will be, by having a 5-year stint ahead of him, Starmer will carry a certain authority. And by virtue of that, if nothing else, I think he'll be treated very, very seriously in European diplomatic circles.
That was Anand Menon, Director of UK in a Changing Europe and Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. Some of the results of this week's election demonstrated that the Middle East in particular is seen by many British voters as a domestic issue. I'm joined now by Mina Al-Oraibi, an Iraqi-British journalist and editor-in-chief of The National, the daily English-language newspaper of the United Arab Emirates. Mina joins us from Abu Dhabi. Mina, I want to start by asking about the degree to which it has actually registered in the Middle East, how much of a factor Gaza has been in the UK's election. At last count, I think 5 pro-Palestine independents have been elected to Parliament, if you count Jeremy Corbyn, the former Labour leader. And that probably wouldn't have happened in at least 4 of those contests if this conflict was not happening.
It certainly has registered amongst those of us who are paying attention to British politics. So I would say, ordinary person on the street is probably much more concerned about the war itself in Gaza and whether there's going to be a war in Lebanon. But for those who are paying attention to the UK, and many do for both historic reasons and feeling affiliation to the UK, but of interest in this country, then yes, that has been quite astounding. We at The National teamed up with Delta Poll for a poll in the UK last week. And we wanted to know if the protests we had seen on the streets of the UK in many, many cities since October would translate to people saying, actually, Gaza does matter in how we're going to vote. And we were pleasantly surprised that for once, foreign policy was actually on the minds of people. Often when you're abroad, you wish that foreign issues register with people, and actually they're more concerned about their day-to-day lives. What we found was 32% of respondents said that Gaza and the politics of each party when it comes to Gaza and Palestine would be important in their decision on how they would vote.
And you mentioned the history of the UK and the Middle East, very frequently not a happy one, but it is an extensive one. Is there actually anything that any Prime Minister of the United Kingdom can do at all about the Israel-Palestine issue in particular? If Keir Starmer decided this is something I want to get into, could he actually make a difference?
He absolutely can make a difference for a number of reasons. First, the United Kingdom is a member of the UN Security Council. Mm-hmm. And as one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, they can have incredible weight on what the UN is doing. Second, the UK continues to sell arms to Israel. Our poll showed that 54% of voters want to see a ban on arms sales to Israel. And that is a very tangible step that Keir Starmer could take as prime minister. Furthermore, he hadn't at first committed to calling for a ceasefire. And it took him until March to actually call for a ceasefire. And so, of course, he has a position, not only a moral duty, so to speak, especially as a human rights lawyer, but also to say this is unacceptable, that the war has gone on for so long and that it's carried out with such brutality. He can also recognize the state of Palestine. Now, that is in the Labour manifesto, and this is going to be one of the first things that people will be looking out for once the foreign secretary is in place, how the British government goes about. A recognition of a state of Palestine is important because it is a way of changing the calculus, that we have to have negotiations before you can get to peace, before you can have a state of Palestine. If major countries like the UK decide to recognize the state of Palestine, as Norway has, as Spain has, and others, it's an indicator that this is a reality. There is a state called Palestine. There is an occupation of this state. It has led to incredibly brutal armed groups like Hamas carrying out horrific attacks like what we saw on 7th of October. And the only way to solve it is to have 2 states for 2 people. And so that would be an important indicator. So undoubtedly, there are steps they can take. Furthermore, Labour traditionally has been seen as a closer in thinking and alignment with those who want to see peace in the Middle East and who have an interest in it and haven't been as close to just one side, which is the case with the Conservatives, who are just clearly closer to the Israeli side of this conflict than the Palestinian.
There's also the relationship the United Kingdom has with the United States, traditionally a very close one, and there is a history there as well of British prime ministers actually being able to exert an influence on American presidents in matters of foreign affairs. One thinks of, Blair persuading Clinton about Kosovo, Thatcher persuading Reagan to sort of be helpful about the Falklands, etc. Is there, or should there be, I guess, any optimism across the Middle East that Keir Starmer might be able to have an influence on President Joe Biden, perhaps even on President Donald Trump?
It's undoubtedly the case that the UK has had an influence previously on US foreign policy. There's a saying in Arabic that the political kitchen for the Americans is actually in London. That was a historical thought. That has changed and, is a reflection of the disarray of the conservative governments of the last 3 to 4 years, frankly, where nobody was expecting that they could have any influence, even though Boris Johnson liked to portray himself as the American whisperer and he could convince Americans, and frankly, he didn't get very far. So I think there is optimism that with a more serious and mature government taking over and having a mature prime minister who's respected globally, then it would mean a return to a traditional role for the United Kingdom to be able to influence or at least advise Washington, and they're clearly in need of advice. That is likely more possible under the Biden administration. How this government would be able to work with the Donald Trump administration is yet to be seen if that was the case. But there is an idea that the UK needs to come back to the world stage. It's been absent from Brexit onwards. And it's also an interesting time because, frankly, the UK left a void that France filled. And now that President Emmanuel Macron has his own domestic woes, and Macron won't have the same sort of influence in the Middle East or try to bring about change. And that's another opportunity, actually, for the UK to then have greater influence and, again, to play a more traditional role that it's had, to try to mediate, to try to come up with solutions. The UK is also the pen holder, and for those who don't know this, at the UN Security Council, different countries are responsible for different files. And the UK is the pen holder for a number of important files, including Sudan, hugely important. And in addition to that, Afghanistan. And these are two important files that, again, haven't really had much traction. And so they can use that role to cajole the Americans, but also the other P5 countries at the UN Security Council to bring about some change to some very, very complex crises around the world.
Mina Al-Oraibi, thank you very much for joining us on the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. This is the Foreign Desk, and finally on today's show, a close look at one vexed election issue which will by definition require outreach abroad: asylum. And joining me is Sarah Singer, Professor of Refugee Law at the Refugee Law Initiative, School of Advanced Study, University of London. Sarah, during the election campaign, the issue of the small boats crossing the Channel was one of former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's very few successful attack lines on Sir Keir Starmer. Sunak kept saying to him, OK, you don't like our ideas about asylum and immigration, but what is Labour's better idea? Did we ever get an answer to that?
Well, I think that there were some attempts by Labour to look a bit more hard-hitting and robust in terms of irregular migration and asylum. So there was the plan for the new Border Security Command, which was going to really vamp up the prosecution of the criminal gangs. And there was a focus on more removals, having a new returns and enforcements unit, which is something that's fair, I think, because the UK has historically been quite poor on facilitating removal of people, back to safe countries that they might have come from. But I think at the same time, Labour perhaps weren't too extreme in their approach to asylum and immigration, because I think really, Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives were starting from a rather odd angle. I mean, starting from a position of, how can we deny access to asylum for all these refugees that are trying to come to the UK? And, a response to that will be, well, maybe some of these people actually have valid protection claims, and maybe we should be processing the claims of some of these people who are genuinely in need of protection and facilitating their integration into our communities.
Starmer did talk a lot, like the former prosecutor that he is, about, as he put it, smashing the gangs, the people traffickers that facilitate this trade, which sounds like an absolutely fine idea. I can't think anybody wouldn't sympathise with that. But if that was readily doable, would that not have been done by now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple truth of it is that the way of breaking the business model of these smuggling gangs, and I think there's a difference here that we need to draw between smugglers and traffickers, okay? The way to break their business model is to reduce the demand for their services, and that's opening up routes that people who have valid protection claims can make a claim for asylum, perhaps not in the UK, right? Perhaps making a claim in France or closer to their region of origin so that they can make that claim, have that assessed, and then be facilitated to enter the UK via a regular route. The reason that the smuggling gangs are so successful at the moment is because there's huge demand for their services, because there's absolutely no way that the majority of these people can legally enter the UK to claim asylum.
Are there countries anywhere that have figured out what actually works? An island country such as this would appear to have a natural advantage, it being, you would think, easier to police a coastline than a long land border. But one of the ideas that has been fondly indulged on the Conservative side, especially in this country, is the Australia model. And Australia did take a very hard line, which did stop boats coming to Australia from north of the country. But is it just that the geography is different there? Australia is much further away from where these people were setting forth, so they were tending to set forth not in small inflatable dinghies, but in much larger craft.
Yeah, well, I think that an attempt to replicate that Australia model was Rishi Sunak's Rwanda plan. And we saw where that Rwanda plan has been taking us. I mean, I think we're at £310 million expenditure so far on a scheme which was failing to, excuse the pun, failing to take off from the ground, right? And did we see the introduction of that policy acting as a deterrent for small boat crossings on the Channel? Did we see the number of boat crossings reducing? No. And exactly the same thing happened in Australia. A year after the Australia regional processing model was brought in, which was about a decade ago, for the next year, we saw higher numbers of irregular boat arrivals to Australia than ever before. In fact, the regional processing camps that were set up got completely overfilled to capacity, and they had to stop sending people to those regional processing units. What actually reduced the number of boat arrivals to Australia is exactly what you were hinting at there. It's focusing on the regions from which these people were starting to make their journeys from, and collaborating with, dubious governments like, the Sri Lankan government, etc., to effectively pull back people to prevent them making these journeys in the first place. I mean, it's a very dubious situation when you start suggesting that, perhaps we should be engaging with, the Libyan government, for example, which is what Italy seems very keen to be doing at the moment. I don't agree that the Australian model actually did stop the boats. It certainly didn't save lives, which was one of the other purported objectives. And I think we saw the way in which these types of processes don't live up to their policies in the last, year of the Rwanda policy not getting off the ground, which we've been witnessing.
Has it then generally been the experience globally? Because the United Kingdom is, of course, not the only country that has a problem with this, and there are many, many countries which have a much, much, much bigger problem with this. Has the general lesson been that a deterrent does not work, that threatening the people who are contemplating making this journey with either some sort of sanction, some sort of punishment, with the idea that there is no pathway to citizenship that starts out like this, does none of that make any dent in it at all?
There's been quite a lot of research, actually, particularly in the European context, about the decision-making processes of people undertaking these journeys. And I think the consensus is that no, it doesn't really make any difference. People embark on these journeys because they have no other options open to them, right? And I would say that, focusing on issues of deterrence is perhaps quite a misplaced place to start, because most asylum seekers and refugees are deterred, right? 75% of the world's refugees and asylum seekers are hosted in their regions of origin. Even larger numbers of people are hosted within their own countries, right? They've relocated to different parts of the countries to escape the persecution or the natural disaster or the conflict that's going on. So actually, most of the world's refugees are deterred. They're staying in their countries or their regions of origin. And then from those that are moving on to, say, within Europe, the UK has far fewer numbers of refugees and asylum seekers than other countries like France and Germany, etc. So I'd say actually most refugees and asylum seekers, they are being deterred, and they're making these journeys. Why? Because there's no other option open to them. And if that's a starting point for someone making a journey, then telling them that there's no pathway to citizenship is not going to make that much of a difference. People aren't educated about, what the intricacies of the asylum system are in a particular state. And they're seeking to move somewhere that they feel they can rebuild their lives. Most people coming to the UK would only seek to go all the way through Europe, right, and then continue on to the UK if there's a reason for doing that, right? So maybe they have cultural ties to the country, they might have linguistic ties, perhaps they were a former colony, perhaps they have family or friends that they could connect with or communities that they could connect with here. These are not decisions that people undertake lightly.
Just as a final thought then, is it then the case that this is a problem that, and I do not envy the politician who tries to make this case to any electorate, that we probably cannot solve this. We probably can't fix it. We can, however, aspire to manage it a bit better.
Yeah, I think it's the problem when you try and take such restrictive measures of saying, no one's going to be allowed to access the asylum system. We're going to expand powers to detain people. We're going to restrict their access to work. Well, all that means is that you're going to be detaining people for longer at huge taxpayer expense, preventing people from contributing members of society. I think that, focusing on the migration and asylum issue as a problem is a poor place to start, really. And actually it only becomes a problem when you have these very restrictive policies which put people in these kind of limbo situations where they can't move on with their lives, they can't contribute, and they cost the taxpayer a huge amount.
Sarah, thank you for joining us. That was Sarah Singer, Professor of Refugee Law at the Refugee Law Initiative, School of Advanced Study, University of London. And that's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for the Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady. Christy also produces the Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Chris at cc@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. Next week's Foreign Desk will be a special episode from the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., so do please tune in for that. From me, Andrew Mueller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.